So when I'm thinking about setting up a pose, certain things I'm looking at, a pose which I think suits the model, tries to sort of really encapsulate, I think, the best qualities of the models are, but also creating a light effect that not only flatters and aids in the creating of a sort of beautiful painting, but also aids me as a painter in how I'm going to see. So for that is I want a couple of key shadows to essentially anchor my painting off. So let's see what we can find. A little bit, and chin down a little bit. So with this pose, so I have a nice solid shadow shape across the eyebrow, down the side of the nose, and underneath the nose, and a shadow up and down the right hand side of the face, which is going to help me really anchor the rest of the head on those major shadows. So personally I think it's a little bit more interesting than the sort of passport style straight on front profile. But what is really important when you're painting, certainly from life, on a model who isn't looking straight at you, is to make sure that you're doing your viewing from the same spot. And it seems quite self-explanatory, but if I'm viewing our model from here, I'm seeing a very different side to if I'm viewing him from further back. So it's key to come back and do all your viewing from the same spot. So just the first couple of marks is I'm just essentially figuring out size and placement of the head on my canvas. So first mark is normally top of head, bottom of chin, back of head, and then front of head. And what you want to make sure is that you don't have head placed in a rather sort of strange part of the canvas. Make sure that you're really making the portrait fit within your canvas in the best way possible. So even if you spend the first sort of 20-25 minutes of your painting just making sure that you've got the head in the right place, I think it's so beneficial. So you can do a great head which then sits in a sort of rather strange position in the canvas which slightly throws you off on where you're going. So I'm going to start off, because I'm working quite small, with a relatively small filbert brush. Means I can get a quite specific line, but also there's going to be enough sort of strength to the brush to put the paint down nice and easily. So again, first couple of marks, it's just getting those, essentially you're finding out where those key shadows are. So those key shadows are going to be the brows, underneath the nose, underneath the jaw. And so you get general placements for them nice and early. So today I'm working on a toned canvas. So yesterday I wiped a very thin layer of raw umber on the canvas. And what this does is it slightly helps you to see, or helps me to see, the tones which I'm putting down earlier on. If I'm working on a white canvas, for me it's a little bit like when you're driving on a motorway and someone has their full beams on. You can't really see the tones of the colours around you because you're slightly blinded by the lights of that sort of pure white. So if I was working on a white canvas, I'd be trying to kill the white as quickly as possible. Whilst on this, I've already got a sort of mid-tone down, which is also closer to the colour of my palette. So what I'm seeing when I'm mixing the paint is closer to what I'm seeing when I put it down. When you're laying in or starting a painting, always try and start with these larger, more geometric straights. Almost see yourself like a sort of sculptor working on a block of marble. And so you're able to chop straights off rather than having to find curves. So you want to see yourself almost as if you're a sculptor chopping either wood or marble. Go from a much larger shape, closing in on our final shape through these larger straights. That way we're going to keep indentations and curves under control, and even the smaller, more intricate parts, I'm still working with straights. Essentially, we're trying to find the sort of geometry of the face. And what I'm doing is just separating light and dark whilst working up the external contour. And bear in mind, these first marks, they're not going to be 100% accurate. You are going to correct them. So it's better to get something down so we can then see what needs to be corrected rather than being too precious over these initial marks. So be nice and broad, nice and confident, get a couple of marks down. I'm really squinting and simplifying the shapes at the moment. So I'm seeing what I can place into shadow and what is in light. So once I've got a general idea of the rough shape of the head, I can start to incorporate that generalized mid-tone for the light as well. Just so we're starting to sort of mass in with essentially both sides of the coin. I'm using a much larger brush now, as I know I'm just sort of massing in larger areas. Always try and use essentially the most efficient brush for the marks you're trying to be making. So if you can, you know, make a mark in a couple of strokes, it's going to be easier than filling, and quicker and easier than filling in the whole thing with. So it's starting very general, light, dark. I'm still going to be sort of moving things around for quite a while at this point. So even at this point, you know, I'm really just simplifying where's light, where's dark. So there are parts where I'm already slightly putting in a bit of a mid-tone just to help get that turn. So essentially, whilst this is looking incredibly vague now, what I'm doing is as closer I get to being confident on where those larger shapes are, the more I'm going to hone in and get more specific with them. So essentially at the moment I'm trying to get that underdrawing whilst filling in some tone at the same time. So when it starts to get a little bit vague and blurry, always go back, try and find those straights to help anchor what you're drawing. So I started to get this much more specific, but at the same time still incredibly generalized idea of the shape of the head. And at this point I'm really not looking for features as such. You're looking more for where those sharper lines of shadow are. The features will come sort of organically through that larger pool of light and dark. So now that I've got a very rough indication of general placement in a head, size of the head I want to put on the canvas, I'm also going to incorporate background, neck and shoulders in there. And I think with the background, is you want the background to, rather than just be a sort of flat surface, is try and create this sense of atmosphere with your background. And a lot of that is finding out how the background tonally relates to the portrait you're viewing, and a lot more so on how it relates to the contour that it's hitting. So you don't necessarily have to be 100% true to what you're seeing, because if you're working from life, as the day progresses, as the weather changes, the background changes, the tone of the background changes, the colour of the background slightly changes. But what doesn't change is the relationship of the background. For example, we have a lighter background here against the dark of his head. We have a slightly darker background here, but it's still light in relation to certain parts of his head. So you're looking for essentially the relationship between the background and the contour that it's touching. I want to keep it quite loose and airy. Lighter element of the background, but also darker than the light of the head. And because I want a slight contrast of the background and what will be the flesh tone, now so I'm going to work into the flesh tone a lot with, you know, these greys. Probably going to end up getting a lot cooler, so I want a little bit more warmth in the background. And I don't mind too much if I lose the odd edge at this point. But just get an indication for the contour, and that's also then going to help us see, when we start to establish our value range a little bit more, how light or dark we can go. So I'm going to ignore the chair behind him. And I can tell that what would be the case is we'd end up with a darker background coming down against the light of the neck. So it'd be slightly darker than the light of the neck. But it might still be lighter than what's going on here, but again, I'm focusing on how it's relating to the external contour of the figure that it's next to. And when you're going for stuff like the shirt, or hair, or, you know, beard, is we're not looking at these as separate entities. We're looking at them still as how the light is bouncing off a form. So if the light flows from one to the other, you have it as light. If its shadow flows from one to the other, you have it as shadow. So that the key is to not separate different elements of the painting purely because we would separate it in a more vocal description. And again, I can see that this here is going to be lighter than the contour it's touching. And you might find when you put in the background that you lose some of the contour, lose some of the sharp. So what we need to do then is just go back in and re-establish a lot of it. Simplify that for the moment, and then I'll get back into it. So I think if you ever feel that you're starting to lose those key shapes, starting to lose a likeness, starting to lose the structure of your drawing, is always go back and re-establish your shadow shapes. And I would say this is the same thing as essentially the first step you do when you come back to a painting, is you re-establish our shadow shapes. And you know, a lot of that is almost a sort of signal of intent, because one can get very precious about what they put down. But if you go in, re-hit your shadow shapes, you know, essentially firm up the edges which you may have softened a little bit the session before, it gets you into the sort of mindset of, I can repaint what I've got down, I can make things better, rather than I must keep the work I'd done before. So again, still working with that base light tone, base shadow tone. And I can see already that my base light tone is probably a little bit too light. So gives me a lot of leeway to push those mid-tones a little bit more. But I imagine when I establish my value range, which I will do soon by putting in the highlights and the darker elements within the shadows, that it'll give me a little bit more leeway to push my lights a little bit darker. And going back to, as you're always going back to those sort of key shapes and those major proportions, those larger pools of light and dark, it's good to sort of keep in mind almost sort of a generalization of where these features may lie. So, for example, eyes tend to be around the middle of the head, probably just above the center point of the head. Nose tends to be about, obviously changes dramatically between each person, but around midway between the eyes and the chin, and then midway between the chin and the bottom of the nose tends to be the mouth. But that way, if you keep that sort of generalization in your head, you're not going to end up extending the mask of the face too high in the head, or having the length of the nose or placements of the mouth too far off from where they should be.